Lauren Sánchez was not the first woman to stand beside immense power and wealth, but she was the first to do it in a way that frightened the system she touched, because throughout history, women have appeared next to kings, oil barons, industrial magnates, tech geniuses, and politicians. Some as wives, some as mistresses, some as advisors, but almost always their power remained secondary. Symbolic, whispered in private rooms. Never acknowledged in daylight, they could decorate mansions, host galas, influence moods, but they were rarely allowed to become power centers in their own right. Lauren did not accept that boundary. She entered Jeff Bezos' orbit, not merely as a partner or companion, but as a strategist with a vision. She saw the machinery.
How's wedding planning? Is it fun?
So you asked.
Lauren Sánchez is done making plans because she's officially a married woman.
But of building her own one, fueled by his connections, but not forever bound to him. And this was the moment she unknowingly signed her own sentence, because in the hidden, unwritten constitution of American elite power, women beside billionaires are tolerated, celebrated, even idolized, so long as they never attempt to seize or mirror that power publicly. The game is ancient, the rules invisible, and they are passed through family circles, boardrooms, golf courses, and Ivy League traditions, and they are enforced without mercy when broken. Lauren ignored them, not naively, but deliberately. She believed the era had shifted. The old patriarchal glass ceilings had cracked. She thought she could become a power parallel to Bezos, not just an accessory to him. She was a television host, a helicopter pilot, a businesswoman. And soon she was presenting herself not as Bezos' glamorous partner, but as Lauren Sánchez, a force in her own right. She started philanthropic projects. She launched initiatives that did not filter through his empire. She appeared in magazines, not as supporting cast, but as lead subject, and each of these steps was another alarm bell to the guardians of the system.
And Sánchez is a fixture in her fiancé's projects, including Blue Origin, where she revealed she plans to go to space with an all-female team in the future. So guys, a wedding and a trip to space? I don't know which is more
extravagant wedding. They allowed the covers, they allowed the charity, but they were watching closely every move, monitored every project mapped to calculate whether she would remain within boundaries. The line is subtle, but real. Woman with power is different from woman of power. The former derives influence through association. The latter dares to establish authority. Independent of the man, Lauren was becoming the latter. And when insiders realized, she was funding her own networks, hiring teams loyal to her, establishing footholds in Hollywood and Washington. The tolerance ended. It was no longer a colorful love story. It was a breach of ancient protocols. Now, if you look at the sequence of what followed, the speed and synchronicity are too neat to be natural. Black Ops Aviation. Her company suddenly flooded with whistleblowers after years of silence. Federal agencies, usually slow, fragmented, suddenly united. FBI, SEC, DOJ moved like one machine. Media narratives flipped. Overnight magazine covers, once glowing, turned to venomous essays about manipulation. Podcasts that celebrated her ambition pivoted to warnings of her cunning. And at the center of this coordinated symphony was Joe Rogan, whose critique of her $5 million wedding spread like wildfire. This was not random. This was precision engineered. Rogan was the perfect instrument. He was mainstream enough to reach millions, yet anti-establishment enough to make his attack seem authentic. His words resonated with male audiences across classes, seeding the idea of Lauren as a manipulative woman exploiting a billionaire. And after Rogan's broadcast, the dam broke. Journalists piled on headlines, shifted, influencers mocked. Her tabloids dug into her past, and suddenly what had been admiration transformed into suspicion, then disgust. Silence became her greatest weakness. The system knew this. In the hyper-connected age, the absence of rebuttal equals guilt. But Lauren was trapped because any word from her could be twisted by prosecutors into obstruction, into evidence of guilt, into manipulation of jurors. So she stayed silent as advised by her legal team. But silence in public opinion is not neutral. It is deadly. Every day she said nothing. The narrative hardened further, and by the time she might have spoken, it was too late. The judgment was written by media. Not courts yet. Soon the courts followed. The entourage around her collapsed with astonishing speed. Producers who praised her vision disavowed her. Socialites who fought for her invitations whispered about her odd behavior. Charities erased her name from reports, as if millions she donated never existed. It was not morality, but survival they saw, the mark of toxicity upon her. and knew that supporting her meant risking contagion, so they amputated her from their world in one coordinated sweep. And all of this raises the haunting question, who ordered the takedown? Who benefited from her destruction? Not the petty rivals of Black Ops, not disgruntled employees. Those were pawns. The true beneficiaries were those invested in keeping power. Predictable, stable male, dominated and controllable. Bezos himself became the most enigmatic figure of all. His silence absolute. His distance swift, his erasure of her from Amazon and Blue Origin materials, efficient as if rehearsed. Was he betrayed and broken? Was he cold and calculating? Was he complicit in the takedown or even its architect? None can see eye. No, yet the choreography of Amazon's cleanup suggests preparation, not improvisation, and that possibility darkens the entire narrative because it suggests she was eliminated, not only by faceless institutions, but by the man whose orbit had given her access in the first place. Yet regardless of his role, what is undeniable is that Lauren Sánchez crossed a forbidden boundary. She dared to demonstrate to the world that intimacy could be startup capital for empire building, that the personal could be converted into political, that love could become leverage, and this terrified the guardians of order because if she succeeded, if she built a durable empire, others would follow, the system's foundations would tremble. And so they chose the only response they ever use against existential threats: ruthless speed, brutal efficiency, total destruction, and a symbolic punishment that would echo as warning to generations: 16 years in prison. No parole, not merely a sentence for financial crimes, but a cultural edict to ambitious women everywhere: do not use intimacy as weapon, do not turn femininity into empire. This was the message behind the trial. The press, the erasure of her presence in elite circles, a warning dressed as justice. And when history revisits this saga, perhaps decades from now, when archives are unsealed and the main actors gone, the verdict may look different. Historians may see not a manipulative woman punished for crimes, but a daring strategist crushed for challenging patriarchy's unwritten rules. Perhaps then her story will be taught not as cautionary tale, but as evidence of how far the system will go to preserve itself, even in a society that preaches equality and progress outwardly for beneath. The slogans, the machinery of power still operates on ancient codes, invisible to the public, merciless to those who transgress them. Lauren Sánchez became the rare woman who exposed these codes not by speeches or protests, but by example, by action, by daring to play the game as equal, and the system responded with all its might to erase her name, to make her fall unforgettable, and to make her story echo as deterrent to anyone who might try the same path in the future. What made the Lauren Sánchez story so chilling to those who watched it unfold from inside elite circles was not just the downfall itself, but the way the downfall was engineered. Because when you look closely at the rhythm of events, you see precision, too exact to be chance, too synchronized to be coincidence. One day she was celebrated as visionary partner to the world's richest man, appearing on glossy covers and couture gowns, hailed for her reinvention from television host to entrepreneur. To philanthropist the next day, she was branded manipulative schemer, unprofessional opportunist. And the pivot happened with such speed that it revealed orchestration. The same editors who had praised her yesterday sharpened knives today. The same columnists who marveled at her transformation suddenly discovered flaws, cracks, artificiality in those very qualities they once admired. This is how the system moves. It never simply withdraws support. It flips the narrative with ruthless efficiency. And once the press turns, the rest of the world follows. Investors distance, producers cancel collaborations, socialites drop names, charities vanish her from archives. And because reputation is the true currency of power, the sudden evaporation of reputation is the same as financial collapse. Once the narrative hardened, she had no defense, for silence was her only option. Advised by lawyers, silence became a trap in the courtroom. Silence is a right, but in the court of public opinion, silence is an admission of guilt every day. She said nothing, every interview request declined, every appearance avoided was turned into proof of her alleged manipulations. Proof she was hiding, proof she was guilty. But what if silence was her only rational choice? What if she was told by legal strategists that one misstep, one defensive comment could be reframed as obstruction or tampering or attempt to sway jurors? She was caught between two arenas, law and media. In one, she could speak and destroy herself legally; in the other, she could stay silent and destroy herself reputationally. It was a no-win game engineered to make her powerless while the system dismantled her image piece by piece. Yet perhaps the most brutal blow was not from prosecutors or journalists, but from those who had once been closest to her, the sudden social amputation of allies who turned their backs overnight. People who had eaten at her table, flown in her helicopters, posed for photos by her side, now spoke to reporters about her arrogance, her manipulation, her supposed delusions of grandeur. These were not new revelations. These were retroactive rewrites of memories designed to justify abandonment in elite society. Betrayal moves fast because reputation contagion is feared like plague. If you defend the condemned, you risk being condemned yourself. And so the amputation was swift, total, merciless, and Lauren was left alone, isolated with only lawyers and strategists, while the empire she had begun to build collapsed like sand under tidal wave. And then there was Bezos, the man around whom this entire orbit spun, the one whose shadow gave her reach and whose silence gave her downfall a different shade of mystery. For his silence was deafening. The world watched and waited for him to defend her, even with a single sentence. But it never came. Was he hurt and betrayed, blindsided by the scale of her ambition? Did he see her empire as threat to his own? Was he calculating sacrificing her to protect Amazon and Blue Origin? Or was he complicit and architect in her removal? Insiders whisper 3 theories. The first is innocence, that he truly did not know she was building independent power, and when the evidence appeared, he felt betrayed and withdrew instantly. The second is cold calculation, that he knew but tolerated her rise until it endangered him and then sacrificed her to save himself. The third is the darkest conspiracy, that he not only tolerated, but secretly helped design the plan to eliminate her when she grew too powerful, too independent, and too dangerous. Each theory reframes the story in radically different light, and yet his absolute silence, his refusal to defend her or even acknowledge her, left the world without clarity. The absence of his voice became another weapon against her, as if even the man she was closest to would not risk touching the toxicity that now clung to her name. And what made observers shiver was how quickly Amazon and Blue Origin erased her from existence. Mentions, deleted photos, scrubbed archives, rewritten, as if her presence had never been part of the corporate story. Such precision in erasure suggests preparation, contingency plans, rehearsed protocols, not improvisation. This was corporate crisis, management at its most efficient, and it fed the suspicion that her takedown was not a natural consequence of discovered crimes, but a managed operation. A controlled demolition executed to send a message not just to her, but to anyone who might attempt what she attempted. And that message was clear. Intimacy may grant access, but it must never be leveraged into independent empire. To try is to trigger annihilation. The scale of the machinery that moved against her reveals how serious the threat was perceived to be. Amazon is not a company, it is a system, a web of interdependencies stretching from warehouses to Wall Street, from logistics hubs to congressional committees. The stability of that system depends on predictability, and predictability depends on the man at the center. When Lauren began shaping influence that was not bound by his sanction, she disrupted the equilibrium. She introduced variables into a machine that demands control. She represented not just a romantic partner gone rogue, but an unpredictable power center, not subject to the usual levers of influence. Contracts, lobbying, donations, board oversight. She could not be voted out. She could not be sued into submission. She was not a shareholder. She was something far more dangerous, a partner who could not be controlled by traditional corporate tools. And so extraordinary measures were justified in the eyes of those protecting the system. Her prosecution, her media, vilification, her social erasure were not about crimes in the traditional sense, but about restoring equilibrium. Her fall was less about justice, more about discipline, more about demonstration for others to watch and understand. The lesson was delivered with brutal clarity when even Joe Rogan's critique became part of the choreography, because his attack seemed organic, but was in fact perfectly positioned. His voice lent authenticity. His audience amplified suspicion. His timing aligned with the beginning of the coordinated media turn, and when his words landed, the press chorus followed, creating echo chamber that transformed public opinion within weeks. The swiftness with which she shifted from dream partner to dangerous manipulator is now studied by media analysts as case study in narrative engineering. The silence that trapped her, the betrayal that isolated her, the erasure that erased her, all of it together formed one coherent strategy to ensure she could never rise again. What remained was the sentence. 16 years without parole, a punishment symbolic as much as legal, a signal that even if laws cannot codify the unwritten rules, the system can still enforce them through spectacle, through media, through federal machinery, through isolation, and imprisonment. Lauren Sánchez became not just a woman punished for alleged crimes, but a cultural symbol, a deterrent, a warning flare shot into sky of elite circles to remind every ambitious outsider that some lines are invisible but real, and once crossed, the system responds like an immune system, eliminating the perceived infection, without hesitation, without mercy, without regret. Her story at this stage was no longer about her. It was about the demonstration of power by those who guard the system, a reminder to the world that intimacy can inspire gossip, but it can never become independent empire without triggering annihilation. And so the story twisted further as whispers became thunder. The name Lauren Sánchez no longer floated in gossip columns but echoed in power corridors. Her presence became unavoidable. She was seated at charity galas next to royalty. She was spotted, boarding helicopters with defense contractors. She walked red carpets with the same smile. But behind that smile was calculation, ambition, and a growing awareness that she had stepped onto a battlefield where rules were written in invisible ink. The elite who had tolerated her now began to see her not as an ornament but as an intruder. The whispers hardened into strategy. People asked, how does she wield such influence over Bezos? How does she turn his gaze away from boardrooms and toward her staged photos? How does she keep him tethered when others could not? And with those questions came the conclusion that she was more dangerous than any rival CEO or politician, because she operated in the shadows without allegiance, only ambition. In a world obsessed with control, she represented unpredictability, the most dangerous trait of all. Yet Lauren did not slow. She leaned into the power, flaunting her yacht trips, flashing the diamond that glowed like a crown, winking at cameras as if daring the establishment to stop her. She knew the rules, but she wanted to rewrite them. And perhaps she believed love would shield her. Perhaps she thought Bezos's billions were a fortress. But the fortress had cracks, and those cracks widened. With every headline, with every court document, with every subpoena that hinted the empire was under review, her name was scribbled in margins of investigations, her movements tracked by those who once pretended not to notice, and soon it became clear. The system would not let her ascend without consequence. History had punished women like her before, women who entered spaces reserved for dynasties and bloodlines. Women who believed love and ambition could buy them a seat at the table when in truth, it only bought them a spotlight and a target. But Lauren persisted. She smiled in Venice. She kissed him on the yacht. She posed in couture gowns while critics wrote venom and allies shrank into silence. Her transformation was nearly complete. From journalist to mistress, from mistress to partner, from partner to something bigger, a figure wrapped in scandal, glamour, and fear. She was not just Lauren anymore. She was a symbol, and symbols cannot be allowed to live freely. Symbols must be managed, destroyed or immortalized in tragedy, and those who watched her knew it. They whispered at dinners, they drafted articles in advance. They placed bets on, when not, if her fall would arrive. The world watched too, some in admiration, others in disgust, but all unable to look away, because Lauren Sánchez had become the kind of character Hollywood itself could not invent. Too flawed, too ambitious, too relentless. And in her rise, the audience sensed the inevitability of collapse, a collapse written, not in gossip, but in the laws of power itself. And then came the silence, the kind of silence that follows storms when the air feels charged and the ground seems unstable. Lauren Sánchez had climbed higher than most dared, but now the climb had turned into a balancing act on glass. She was everywhere, and yet nowhere. Her smile was still fixed, but it carried the weight of awareness. She was no longer simply a partner to the richest man alive. She had become the question mark hanging over him, over his empire, over the future of the power structures she had trespassed upon. The cameras still flashed, but the tone of the question shifted. The public no longer asked who she was. They asked how long she would last. The headlines no longer celebrated glamour. They dissected motives, calculated moves, exposed contradictions. The same spotlight that elevated her began to scorch her skin. The same luxury that once dazzled now looked incriminating. The yacht parties became exhibits, the diamonds evidence, the photos trophies in a trial of public opinion. Lauren had miscalculated not in her ambition, but in the assumption that ambition could exist without punishment in her story. There was a pattern older than Hollywood, older than America itself. The woman who dared to wield too much power without lineage, without legacy, without the right permissions, was always destined to be broken down. History remembered them not for their victories, but for their downfalls. And Lauren felt that weight, whether she admitted it or not. The whispers turned into accusations, the accusations into legal battles, the legal battles into symbols of something far bigger than her marriage, her love, her life. She had become a vessel through which society argued about class ambition, gender betrayal. The system did not just want her silenced. It wanted her displayed as a warning, a reminder that entry into forbidden spaces carried consequences. She had mastered the art of spectacle. But spectacle is a dangerous currency when the dealers are more powerful than you. For every gala dress, there was a leaked document for every yacht appearance. There was a subpoena for every carefully posed photograph. There was a whispered deal struck in secret rooms to ensure her eventual collapse, and yet even as the walls closed in, Lauren refused to shrink. She leaned into the storm, as if believing that endurance itself might rewrite the ending. She stood taller, smiled brighter, traveled further, posed longer. But it only deepened the inevitability. She was playing a role scripted by forces larger than herself, and the third act of that script was always tragedy. The fall did not come with one moment, but with many. Each headline, another stone. Each scandal, another. Crack, each betrayal, another cut, until the woman who once seemed untouchable looked suddenly fragile, isolated, surrounded but alone, and the world watched, hungering for the fall, not out of cruelty alone, but because the story demanded it. Every myth, every empire, every queen without a throne must eventually meet her undoing. And so Lauren Sánchez became both lesson and warning. Her name, etched not in the marble of dynasties, but in the cautionary tales whispered in corridors of power. The woman who reached too far too fast, who mistook love for shield and ambition for destiny. Her fate sealed not by the man beside her, but by the invisible hands of a system that never forgives trespassers. She wanted to be remembered as partner, lover, queen. But in the end, she was remembered as something else entirely, a symbol of how quickly the light can turn into fire, how power courts destruction, how ambition without lineage becomes not victory, but sacrifice. And with that, her story closed not with applause, but with silence. The same silence that follows storms when the wreckage is still being measured, and the air is heavy with what could have been. The dismantling of Lauren Sánchez's image was not a sudden explosion, but a carefully orchestrated dissection, like a surgeon with a scalpel. The media did not destroy her in one strike. They cut piece by piece, each quality once celebrated redefined. Inverted turned against her beauty that had once earned glowing magazine spreads, became evidence of vanity, of artificiality, of someone obsessed with image rather than substance. Ambition that was once framed as inspirational became rebranded as dangerous, manipulative hunger for influence. Her intelligence, which once drew admiration, was now cast as cunning deviousness. The narrative shifted like a mirror flipped overnight, where yesterday the light was flattering, today it was distorted, harsh, cold. And what makes this process chilling is how synchronized it was across outlets. Publications that traditionally compete for angles suddenly aligned, speaking the same language, using the same frames, reinforcing the same archetype of the manipulative woman exploiting a billionaire. It was as if invisible editors had convened in secret and distributed talking points. And once the public heard the same refrains from all directions, the perception hardened and became unshakable. This was no longer Lauren, the ambitious partner of Jeff Bezos. This was Lauren the schemer, Lauren the opportunist, Lauren the predator. And that transformation in image was more devastating than any legal charge, because reputational death precedes legal death. By the time prosecutors filed indictments, public opinion had already pronounced guilt. The case was over before it began in the minds of millions, and silence made it worse. Every headline unchallenged, every accusation unanswered, confirmed the narrative further. Yet silence was not her only enemy. Timing was timing too perfect, too seamless, as if gears of different machines had been oiled to run together. The complaints against her company surfaced just as the Rogan critique went viral. The federal agencies moved just as the magazines flipped narratives. The prosecutors announced charges just as allies publicly abandoned her. Each event reinforcing the next like dominoes, falling in rhythm. too precise to be coincidence, normally. The FBI, the SEC, the DOJ work slowly mired in bureaucracy, turf wars, paperwork delays. Yet in Lauren's case, they moved with speed that resembled military coordination. Subpoenas filed within weeks. Testimonies gathered instantly, evidence processed. With uncanny efficiency, this was the federal machine functioning like Swiss watch not stumbling giant it usually is, which suggests not accident, but plan. And if there was a plan, then the question becomes who designed it? Who had the reach to align? Media influencers, federal agencies, and corporate allies to move as one. Some point to Bezos himself, some to competitors in Silicon Valley, some to political operators in Washington, who saw her rise as destabilizing. Whichever the truth, the choreography is undeniable. It was too neat to be organic, and the effect was devastating. Because once federal machinery moves, the outcome is almost predetermined. Trials may appear open, but when the narrative has already been written, the jury is already conditioned. By months of headlines, the verdict becomes formality. And so it was with Lauren by the time she stood before court. She was already guilty in eyes of the public, and in a system that values reputation as much as legality, that perception carried. Weight in sentencing, her 16-year punishment carried symbolism. It was not about dollar amounts or technicalities. It was about deterrence, about spectacle, about message to others watching. But beyond law and media, the most painful wound for Lauren was the betrayal of the social world that once adored her. Because in high society, loyalty is transactional. While admiration can be rented with wealth, it can be repossessed overnight when toxicity taints a name those who once smiled at. You and Galis rush to erase photos. Those who praised you in speeches. Rewrite scripts to condemn those who sat at your table. Whisper rumors to reporters. It is not personal. It is survival. And Lauren experienced this with brutal clarity. People she funded, charities she elevated, industries she collaborated with, all vanished or worse turned critic. And that speed of abandonment was orchestrated too, because the system needed to show that support for her was not only foolish, but dangerous to one's own reputation. Her friends did not betray out of principle. They betrayed out of fear. They knew she had been marked, and no one defends the marked without risking contagion. So the amputation was surgical overnight, total, merciless. And Lauren found herself utterly alone, facing the machinery of media, law, and society, with no shield, no allies, no defenders. And in that isolation, her silence became heavier, a void into which critics poured every accusation, every theory, every suspicion without. Resistant silence is blank page, and her enemies wrote their narrative on it until it became truth to millions. And so the process was complete. Media destroyed her image. Allies destroyed her support, law destroyed her freedom. Bezos destroyed her. Relevance by silence and corporate erasure. Together, these forces formed a storm no individual could withstand. And that storm was not natural weather. It was engineered, a demonstration of power, a warning to others because the true threat was not Lauren's actions alone, but the precedent she represented. She showed the world that intimacy could be converted into power, that a woman could stand beside the richest man alive, and instead of being decoration, she could become independent force. This was intolerable to those who maintain order, because if she succeeded, others would follow, and soon the entire architecture of elite control would wobble, so she had to be removed swiftly, mercilessly as example, and her destruction achieved. Exactly that it taught every observer in Hollywood and Washington and Silicon Valley that the rules remain the same, that the invisible codes are enforced even in 21st century America, that a woman may rise through talent, merit, politics. But if she attempts to use proximity to male power to create rival power, she will face annihilation. And this lesson spread like whisper through clubs, through boardrooms, through private circles. The kind of whisper meant to remind everyone of boundaries. Invisible but real, and Lauren's fate became not personal tragedy alone, but institutional demonstration. Her story no longer hers, but property of the system to be told, retold, and framed as needed.
This video covers legal allegations in a news context. All claims are from official filings, and no guilt is implied until proven in court. Please keep all discussions respectful. Allegations are not facts until proven in court.